$500 of drone against $300 million of bomber. On the 1st of June, 2025, first-person view quadcopters lifted out of the roofs of parked trucks deep inside Russia and burned strategic bombers where they stood. Satellite imagery later confirmed around a dozen aircraft destroyed, two 985 and two 22M3 bombers among them. Each drone weighed roughly 2 kilograms, a little over 4 pounds, and cost about what a used laptop costs. The aircraft they burned cannot be replaced at any price. Those production lines closed decades ago. On the same open concrete sat the Tu-160, the $300 million aircraft at the top of that fleet, and the physics does not care which of them a drone reaches. So how does $500 destroy $300 million? Everything hangs on the gap between two price tags. Start with the machines on either side of it. The weapon is a first-person view drone, an FPV, which means the pilot flies it through a live video feed from a camera on its nose while wearing goggles, as though sitting inside it. Stripped down, there is very little to it. A carbon fiber frame about the size of a dinner plate, 4 small electric motors, a flight controller the size of a coin, a battery, a radio link, and a warhead, often a repurposed anti-tank grenade weighing a kilogram or two. The design came straight out of the drone racing hobby. Ukrainian and Russian workshops turned that hobby into a weapon across 2022 and 2023, and both sides now build these drones in enormous numbers. A single unit runs from a few $100s to around $2,000 depending on the model. Call it $500 for a typical one. The parts come off the shelf, the assembly happens in a small workshop, and nothing about it needs a runway or an aerospace factory. Nobody sits inside it. The target is a strategic bomber, and the most expensive one in the Russian inventory is the Tu-160, the largest and heaviest combat aircraft ever built, a swing-wing machine designed to carry cruise missiles across a continent. 4 afterburning engines, each the size of a small car. Roughly a third of its empty weight is titanium. Russia built around 3 dozen of the originals in the Soviet and early Russian era, and current tracking puts the number still flying at somewhere near 18. The production line sat shut for about 2 decades. Russia restarted it at the Kazan plant, and a newly built example first flew in January 2022, though finished aircraft leave that line at roughly 2 a year. Estimates for a single modernized Tu-160 run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, and $300 million is a defensible figure. 2 a year is the number that matters. Expense is only half the story, because at that build rate the bomber is close to irreplaceable. The aircraft is built around a titanium-heavy airframe and specialized engines whose tooling and skilled workforce largely lapsed when the line first closed, and neither comes back overnight. The older Tu-985, the type confirmed destroyed on the 1st of June, is worse still. That line ended decades ago and will never restart. There are only a few dozen strategic bombers of any type in the entire Russian fleet, and every one lost is a permanent subtraction. The drone sits at the opposite end of every one of those sentences. It is cheap enough to be thrown away by the thousand, and it forces the defender into a trade that no Air Force has ever survived for long. A monument for a laptop. How a 2-kilogram machine actually reaches one of those bombers and then burns it is where the physics starts. A drone that kills a bomber has solved 2 separate problems: reaching the aircraft without being stopped, then destroying something 1,000 times its own size. Physics answers both, and reaching comes first. A strategic bomber does not sit alone. It lives inside one of the most heavily defended systems on the planet, a layered net of early warning radar, surface-to-air missiles, and fighter patrols. How a plastic quadcopter crosses all of that comes down to what those systems were built to see. And none of them were built to see something this small crawling along at rooftop height. Air defense is tuned for fast jets and cruise missiles arriving high and quick from far away. Radar looks for a large metal object moving at hundreds of meters per second at altitude. An FPV drone fails every part of that description. It is mostly plastic and foam, giving it a radar cross-section measured in hundredths of a square meter, roughly that of a bird. Detection software is written to throw returns that small away, because otherwise every flock of birds over the airfield would raise an alarm. It moves at the speed of a car, so systems that filter for fast movers discard it as clutter. And it hugs the ground at rooftop height, hiding under the radar horizon, the line below which the curve of the Earth itself blocks the beam. Picture a security system built to catch a speeding truck at the front gate. A moth walking across the floor never trips it. To a multi-million-dollar air defense network, an FPV drone is close to a moth. Even when a defender does see it, there is a hard physical ceiling on the response. A defending battery has only so many ready interceptors pointed the right way at any given moment, and only so many seconds to use them. Reloading a launcher takes minutes. The drones arrive in seconds, that is magazine depth, and no budget changes it in the moment of an attack. Send more drones than a defense can engage at once, and some always get through, by simple arithmetic. Because each drone is disposable, the attacker can afford to send far more than the defender can physically service. That is saturation, and it makes a swarm a different kind of problem from a single aircraft rather than a larger version of the same one. The larger weakness has nothing to do with radar or missiles. A bomber is only a flying fortress while it is flying. On the ground, parked on open concrete between missions, it is a very large, very fragile object. Aircraft this size do not fit inside hardened shelters, and there are nowhere near enough shelters big enough, so they sit in the open, wingtip to wingtip, plainly visible from orbit on airfields that appear on any commercial satellite map. Every defense that makes a bomber formidable in the air is switched off on the tarmac. The parked aircraft is the opening the whole attack is built around. That solves reaching it. Destroying it works differently from the way most people picture it. A 1 or 2 kilogram warhead is nothing against an airframe the size of a building. Detonated against solid structure, it scorches some panels and does little else. So the drone goes after weak points instead of mass, and a fueled bomber is covered in them. The wings are enormous fuel tanks. The engines are packed with turbine blades spinning at tremendous speed and fed by that same fuel. The warhead is usually a shaped charge, a design that focuses its blast into a narrow, high-speed jet of metal that punches through armor far better than a plain explosive of the same weight. When that jet reaches a wing root or an engine intake, it does not blow the aircraft apart. It starts a fire. An aluminum airframe, thousands of liters of jet fuel, and a puncture in exactly the wrong place, and the fire finishes what the warhead began, consuming the aircraft from the inside out. Think of a lit match dropped into a fuel tank rather than a sledgehammer swung at a wall. The match is trivial. The fuel does the work. Precision is the last piece, and it is what separates an FPV drone from a thrown grenade. The pilot is not lobbing and hoping. Through the live camera feed, in real time, the drone is steered into a single chosen point rather than at the aircraft as a whole. In the strikes analysts have examined afterward, the damage clusters where the fuel and the engines are, well away from where the airframe is strongest. Accuracy that a generation ago demanded a guided missile now comes from a hobby-grade controller and a video link, and the newest drones are closing their one real weakness. The main defense against an FPV has been electronic warfare, jamming the radio link between pilot and machine. So the latest models drop the radio entirely and trail a hair-thin fiber optic cable that unspools behind them for kilometers, immune to jamming because there is no signal to jam. Others are gaining simple onboard machine vision that locks onto the shape of the target in the final seconds, completing the run even if the link to the pilot is cut. The cheap weapon keeps getting harder to stop. All of that stayed theoretical until the 1st of June 2025, when Ukraine ran an operation that put every piece of the physics together in a single morning. The operation was called Spiderweb. According to Ukraine's security service, the SPU, it took about 18 months to prepare. The problem the planners faced was range. Russia's strategic bombers are based far from the front, and a small FPV drone flies a handful of kilometers, not thousands. So the drones never flew to the targets, they were smuggled there. By the SPU's account, drones were concealed inside the roofs of ordinary cargo trucks under panels built to slide open by remote command, driven deep into Russia by drivers reportedly unaware of what they were hauling, then parked near the air bases. On cue, the roofs opened and the drones rose, already sitting a few hundred meters from their targets. Belaya, in Siberia, is roughly 4,300 kilometers from Ukraine, about 2,700 miles. Olenia, up in the Arctic near Murmansk, is closer, around 2,000 kilometers. A better drone never solved the range problem that had protected those bombers for decades. A truck did. If the mechanics behind the headlines are the reason you are here, subscribing keeps them coming. Now, the record. The numbers need care here, because 3 different figures circulate and they do not mean the same thing. Ukraine's SPU claimed the strike hit around 41 aircraft and caused roughly $7 billion in damage. That is a one-sided claim by the attacking government and should be held as one, since the attacker has every reason to state the highest number it can defend. United States officials briefed reporters with a lower figure, about 20 aircraft hit and around 10 destroyed. Independent analysts working from satellite imagery, including NATO's assessment and open-source teams at outlets like the War Zone, confirmed somewhere between 10 and 13 aircraft destroyed. The honest summary is this. Ukraine claims about 40 hit. Independent imagery supports roughly a dozen destroyed. Both statements are true, and the gap between them is the difference between what a government asserts and what outside analysts can actually see. The airframes matter as much as the count. What imagery confirms destroyed are 2 95 strategic bombers, 6 or 7 of them, and around 4 Tu-22 M3s. Ukraine also claims 2 160s among the losses, and that specific claim is not independently confirmed. Footage from the day is inconclusive, and other imagery shows 2 160s parked undamaged. Whichever list is correct, the aircraft confirmed lost are among the most valuable in the Russian fleet, destroyed on their own runways by machines costing a few $100s each. How that confirmation gets done explains the gap. Analysts working from commercial satellite imagery compare before and after passes over the same airfield and look for specific signatures: a burn scar on the concrete, a collapsed wing, an airframe whose shadow has changed shape, or a shape that is simply gone. 2 passes days apart over the same stretch of parking apron, and the difference between them is the entire evidence base. An aircraft that is badly damaged but structurally intact often looks unchanged from orbit, so a confirmed destroyed count is deliberately conservative and will always sit below the true total. The method is built to undercount, which is why a claim of 40 and a confirmation of about a dozen can both be honest numbers at the same time. Now hold the 2 costs against each other, because the exchange rate is doing the real damage. A surface-to-air missile runs $1 million or more. The American Patriot Advanced Capability 3 interceptor, the PAC-3, costs several million per shot. That means a single interceptor can cost more than an entire launch wave of drones, and a hardened shelter costs more than the fleet of drones sent to find the aircraft that will not fit inside it. The losses compound the problem. Because Tu-95 production ended decades ago and the tooling is gone, so each one is subtracted permanently rather than reordered. The arithmetic scales brutally in one direction only. At $500 a unit, 100 drones cost $50,000, which is less than the price of a single spare component on the aircraft they are hunting. No defense budget on Earth is built to survive that trade. Strategists have a name for weapons that work this way: attritable mass. The idea that a swarm of cheap machines you can afford to lose in bulk will outlast a small number of exquisite, expensive platforms you cannot. Scale is what turns a striking ratio into a decisive one. Both sides now produce first-person view drones at industrial rates, with credible estimates running into the millions of units per year, and Russian manufacturers alone are reported to be turning out fiber-optic drones in the tens of thousands per month. A defender who wins 99 intercepts and misses the 100th has still lost an aircraft that no number of destroyed drones comes close to paying for. Russia is not the only air force living with this. The most expensive aircraft in the world sit on open tarmacs, too. An American B-2 bomber costs around $2 billion, and its future replacement, the B-21, along with fleets of frontline fighters, will operate from bases designed around a threat arriving from over the horizon rather than from a truck in the parking lot next door. Spiderweb exposed a structural gap in every air force built the same way, not a Russian failure of housekeeping. One principle sits underneath all of it. For most of the last century, air power ran on a single rule. The side that could afford the most exquisite machine controlled the sky. That rule quietly assumed the expensive machine was out of reach of anything cheap. The FPV drone breaks the assumption rather than the machine. Once a $500 weapon can reliably reach and burn a bomber worth hundreds of millions, cost stops being a detail of war and starts deciding wars. 3 consequences are already visible. First, dispersal and shelter. Expect air forces to spread aircraft out, build far more hardened shelters, and stop parking their most valuable machines in neat, visible rows. A shelter big enough for a strategic bomber takes years and hundreds of millions to build, which is most of why those rows exist at all. Second, a defensive spending scramble, and this is where most of the money will go. Netting over parking areas, layered jamming, and cheap close-in weapons, from rapid-fire guns to directed energy systems, all designed to kill a drone without spending a missile on it. The appeal of a laser or a rapid-fire gun is entirely economic. A directed energy shot costs a few dollars of electricity instead of millions of dollars of interceptor, and that is the only route by which a defender ever drags the exchange rate back onto its own side. Expect that to be the central race of the next decade, and expect it to be judged on cost per kill, the only measure that survives contact with a swarm. The inversion matters. The defender is now the one forced to spend heavily to stop a weapon that stays cheap, which is the exact reverse of how air power used to work. Third, the weapon keeps improving. Fiber optic control, onboard targeting, and coordinated swarms are already shrinking the gaps defenders are trying to plug. Each of those upgrades costs the attacker very little and forces the defender into another expensive redesign. None of this is a trick waiting to be patched. The arithmetic of the air has changed permanently. The cheapest machine on the field has become one of the most dangerous, and the era of the untouchable, unaffordable platform is closing. Whether that decides the outcome of any particular war is a separate question, and one worth holding lightly. What it does change is what every Air Force on Earth now has to plan around, which leads to the question defenders are already losing sleep over. When the swarm comes, what actually stops it?